Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the Sonic Cinema podcast YouTube channel. We're continuing on a horror bent with the Class of 1999 series, and this is one of the more successful movies in the genre, both financially and creatively from that year. It's Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, and joining me to discuss the movie is a filmmaker I've had on before. We've discussed The Matrix, we've discussed The Mummy, we've also discussed his own work, and I'm pleased to be joined once again by David Spaltro. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, man, it's always a pleasure.
So, one of the things that I really kind of love about Sleepy Hollow, it's probably been one of my favorite Tim Burton movies ever since it came out in 1999, is that it's a movie that it fits well within the realm of the type of movies that he was making at the time. You think about his Batman movies, you think about Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice, and then you think about stuff he did later like Sweeney Todd and Dark Shadows. It very much fits in with the trajectory of the movie, of his filmography, but it also is stands apart in it because of the fact that it's the only time that he's really done pure horror. And I think that's one of the things that I really kind of love about it, is that it feels like there's an affection for the genre, and in particular the Hammer horror films, that is really prevalent throughout this entire movie, and it's one of the things that I think I really love about this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it really was one of the last few films he did that were sort of more original before he kind of went on a bent of doing more random Tim Burton cover versions of
Yeah.
remakes of film, which is his thing now. But it is that the Hammer horror aspect is something that like really, because I grew up with that. My father first introduced me to it, and the idea of horror films that were kind of made purely almost in a way for adults first and foremost, and that they had all the tricks and treats you'd find in like Universal or other things, but they
Yeah.
had a lot where there was just a little bit more of like a sexual undertone, a psychological. They were soap opera, devious things happening in a town, a recurring cast of actors that were like throughout all the different films. It just felt like horror at a higher level for
Yeah.
people who wanted that kind of like fully realized and developed, meat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the way that Burton was actually able to kind of do a horror film, because while a lot of his stuff, you could say like why hasn't he done more straight horror films? I think he really enjoys sort of tap dancing in the macabre and sort of the other realm of misfits and weirdness. But I think he once said something about like real horror scares him.
Yeah.
So I think this was his way of kind of being able to do that.
Yeah, and the thing is, I had not been familiar with Hammer horror before Sleepy Hollow, but this film, reading the reviews at the time, seeing people uh, compared to Hammer horror, bringing up the fact that Christopher Lee and Michael Gough, who have roles in this movie, were part of the Hammer series in the 50s and 60s, it definitely got me interested to the point where I gave it a chance a couple years later when I really started to give horror another shot, and I really do love, like you said. I mean, we talked about the Universal horror movies earlier this year when we talked about The Mummy. This film, Hammer, like you said, is more attuned towards adults. It's more vicious. You look at their versions of Dracula, you look at their versions of Frankenstein, you look at the different versions of the Mummy, even, and there is something a bit harder edged to horror. And the thing that I think I really love about it is that you've got the atmosphere. Not to say Universal didn't have atmosphere, but it seems to be ramped up to 11 with Hammer. And in addition, you have these narratives that are really character driven as opposed to idea driven, and that's one of the things that I really think that Tim Burton really brings to this movie, because I love the fact that it's not just a retelling of the Headless Horseman. In Washington Irving's story, there had to be more to it, and
Absolutely.
there's this whole world, this whole town. You feel like you come to know this whole town, and that's one of the things that I really love about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely being able to. They not only did they open up the film, they avoided both doing a trunicated like, oh my god, is this all there is? Just a horseman that hunts people down like and kills every 5 minutes, or over padding it to the point where there was no meat. They really sort of made it. I think one of the things that Hammer succeeded at doing, besides sort of elevating the horror with more psychological stuff, is they played up about how no matter what was the evil in the film, supernatural or whatnot, monster, that the people were in the town, or the human beings were as bad, if not worse, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe, you know what I mean? And I feel like, again, like that's a big part of this film too, is that, like, the secrets people keep, the conniving sort of jealousy, those are the real monsters of those films, and also of this film, that they were able to translate really well.
Yeah. I will say, I mean, if there's one thing about the story as a whole that just kind of doesn't really work for me, it's a familiar, it became a familiar trope with Tim Burton, where you have an idea, you have Ichabod, played by Johnny Depp in this role, having flashbacks to his mother, and
Oh yeah.
and the trauma that she dealt with, and the trauma that he dealt with because of her death. And it's like, that's probably like the one thing. I mean, I understand it's to help humanize Ichabod to a certain degree, because the thing I like about Ichabod in this, and the way that Depp performs him, is that he he brings a very scientific and rational perception to these events, compared to the citizens of Sleepy Hollow, who are more driven by belief and superstition. And I think that combination, that warring of those two ideas, is really interesting in this movie.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, the mother thing, because I also, that is one of the things that kind of like really sticks out to me in the film, is not working. And for me, it really is because it doesn't quite stick the landing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think the flashbacks are really well done, some nasty business, and I think it does give some more development to Ichabod as the film progresses. I just never think that it. I think the most it ties in is, it's like he saw a symbol once because his mom was like a good witch or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah.
still don't know. It doesn't really. It didn't need to be there. They could have either just had it, or the way they connected it to the film could have been stronger. But what you said also about the town, and sort of how he brings science to the town, and they're sort of more mystical, and they're also sort of, it's very interesting, because it was sort of like, I think the polarization in politics at the time, maybe it's too much in my head, but it almost felt like you got this crazy scientific coastal elite coming to like the rural area that he doesn't understand,
Yeah.
and there is that sort of like, well, we're very closed off, and this is how we do things here, and he's got this, and there's that immediate distrust and lack of understanding, even though they're, what, maybe a couple, at that time period, maybe a couple 100 miles away from the
Mm-hmm.
city to, the wherever they are in Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, and it's funny because of the fact that, like, this is basically set in the year 1719 or 1799, going into 1800, and like the movie came out in 1999, going to the year 2000. So it's like, obviously they're trying to do some parallels as far as it feels like they're trying to do some parallels to the time period that the movie came out, but at the same time, it's like there's so much more going on. I like the fact that that's in the background, and not necessarily, because at a certain point Ichabod has to recognize, and he does in the movie, that it's like, oh my god, they're actually telling the truth about this. There's a headless horseman, and everybody's like, yes, we know, we understand that. That's what we've been trying to tell you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also another brilliant part of the film when we were talking about them sort of adapting it and expanding upon it, is that they took basically, with some like alterations, the Sleepy Hollow short story, and that is maybe the first act of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like when after that whole bit is done and they do the whole great, classic bridge scene, when he realizes what it really is, it's literally, that's the beginning of the film, and you get this whole other story. And I thought that was handled really well.
Yeah, and then you have the but before he actually meets the headless swordsman, you have that fake out where it's just people from the town messing with him.
Sure.
And so you have that start, even though we realize based on the flashbacks we've seen that the elders in the town tell him that it is in fact true, because let's face it wouldn't be much of a movie if it weren't true. But at the same time, it's you've got this idea that he has this, you have to give him that moment of disbelief before, of real disbelief of, oh well, it's like these guys are trying to mess with me, and then before you lay it on, oh no, this is actually happening. You need to open your mind to it, and that's one of the things that I like about it. But one of the things that's also really interesting about the screenplay by Andrew Kevin Walker and Kevin Yeager, the thing that I like about this is that they also bring in this larger conspiracy. And I mean, you kind of have to, because it is a short story. It is, so there's only so much you would be able to do with it if you adhered to the story itself for 105 minutes. You can't really do that. So you have to bring in more dramatic weight. And like you said, there's really not much fat in what they do. And one of the things they do is they point to a larger conspiracy with regards to what's going on in the town leading up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think what's great about the way that they incorporate the whole town aspect as well is that, I'm losing my train of thought, that once he accepts the supernatural, he also then has to kind of do another more scientific investigation, because it's not just supernatural. There are human hands behind, what is going on.
Right.
And I think he becomes a believer, but it still doesn't turn off the analytical thing of like, okay, if I'm dealing with this, why is this happening? Why is it happening to these certain people? And I think that is still, like what you're talking about, that great blend of science and superstition.
Yeah. This is a movie that it ended a run in the 90s between Tim Burton and Johnny Depp that I think is probably the most satisfying that they've had as collaborators. I mean, they've worked together many, many times since, but with this being the culmination of, with Edward Scissorhands and then Ed Wood, I really like the way that they that this sort of rounds out a trilogy of sort of misfits for Depp and Burton, and you really do kind of see the you see what connects these two artists together, and it's really entertaining to watch.
Yeah, they found like a perfect symmetry that they sort of elevated each other's game as well as completed it. Whereas now, much like Tim Burton is sort of doing Tim Burton-esque cover versions of previous movies that have been made, Johnny Depp, what he did for Burton in the 90s, much more organically and much more realistically, creating these like very unique, living, breathing, pure characters, whether it was Ed Wood or, Edward Scissorhands. Now he sort of is just like, what's the weirdest costume and wig that I can disappear? And which is fine. It's still to watch an actor just go balls, much like Nicolas Cage does and everything.
Yeah.
But it felt more real and organic, and that Burton and Depp were both dreaming together and kind of pushing each other to a sort of symmetry and greatness that is just it's more it's like now it's just wacky dress up fun time, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think the only time they really came close to matching what they did in the 90s afterwards was Sweeney Todd, and that's because of
Yes.
the material that they had. I mean,
Yeah. That was actually that was a pretty good marriage of them as well.
yeah. And it's also the only other like sort of kind of horror movie that they've done together too. And it's really kind of, and it's before Depp doing all of these wild characters really sort of became stale to a certain extent. And it's before their collaboration together really kind of hit a wall as far as creatively. And the thing is, and you talked about Burton sort of like doing his versions of existing of remakes and stuff like that. Man, it's so like one of the things that kind of occurred to me like is that if you really think about it, there are few. I mean, there are a lot of really terrific Tim Burton movies. Don't get me wrong. To a certain extent, he is still one of my favorite filmmakers. But at the same time, it's like if you look at his larger body of work, he really has only done a handful of just truly, genuinely original movies. Like
Yeah.
that weren't based on, people, individuals who weren't based on previous properties and stuff like that. I mean, really, you have Pee Wee's Big Adventure, you have Beetlejuice, and Edward Scissorhands.
I mean, and even Pee Wee was Paul Rubens' baby long before he got there.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, he really but I mean, I think what's interesting is as much as he's a creative force in his his journals and the books he's released and the artwork he used to do, he started out in Disney's animation, crafting stuff for hire.
Yeah.
So that might have also been his way of being able to like both channel his artistic impulses and his version of stuff, but like sort of be trained to kind of like find material that he could like infect in a way and like do his own version of.
Oh yeah, I mean you look at Frankenweenie, whether you're talking about the short or whether you're talking about the stop motion feature they did later, where it's like it's essentially that sort of like Edward Scissorhands is akin to Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And I mean, Frankenweenie, of course, is a very literal sort of interpretation of the Frankenstein story, but with a boy and his dog. And yeah, it's like that's one of the things, but you also look at something like Vincent they did, and there is a real, sense of originality to him, and it's like it feels like as much as it's really such a it's so weird to think about Burton's career because of the fact that it's like you almost wonder whether him having the financial freedom of and the success with something like say even the Batman movies, which I do really enjoy, is it kind of hurt him because of the fact that it's like then to a certain extent then studios were able to go, oh hey, here's what we want to do. We want to do something kind of weird and wacky. We'll get Tim Burton to do it.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, like his success in being able to do that with Batman, and to a certain extent with Sleepy Hollow, and then it got to the point with the Planet of the Apes reboot, that the remake they did, where it's like, okay, yeah, I think we're just, I feel like we're sort of jumped the shark to a certain extent as far as the type of the material got less and less interesting the longer he went on to do it.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the weirdest interceptions of many interceptions in film history, because I think up until a few months before they got Burton to do that. I think it was supposed to be James Cameron.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
which
he
is
had
like,
tried for a while with Schwarzenegger.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. But I mean, but I think it's funny because going back to Sleepy Hollow, you can also, as original and as interesting and as hammer as this film is, because it's still somewhat with some of the gore and nasty bits in the film, it's still a big studio film. They were looking as like a tentpole film.
Yeah.
Fall release. There are these weird moments that you can see him. Even though he did action in Batman, there is a very weird kung fu scythe fight with the Headless Horseman with Ichabod Crane and that other actor, which
Casper Van Dien.
So out of place. I mean, I think that was the Headless Horseman was played by Ray Park, who had done Darth Maul that year, and I think there was a good year and a half where he was like every time they needed like an action stunt person to do like crazy flip sword fights, he was there.
Oh yeah,
and he's brilliant. But of all the things he did, this felt like the most randomly out of place that the Headless Horseman is doing like basically a kung fu fight.
Right. Well, yeah, and I had forgotten that I can't believe I had forgotten that Ray Park played the Headless Horseman when he was headless, because when we see him with his head in the flashbacks, it's of course the great Christopher Walken, and
dental work.
But man, I had completely forgotten that was Ray Park. But yeah, I mean you're absolutely right, because of Darth Maul, because of the notoriety of that, and this and he had done he would do was Toad in the X-Men, and it's one of those things where it's like, that fight is completely ridiculously hilarious because of it. You're right, it is absolutely out of place, and it is almost superfluous because of the fact that, like Ichabod, tells Casper Van Dien's character in it, it's like he's not coming for you. He's not trying to, he's going. You don't have to do this. And that's it's something that's really it's something that's just really entertaining about the movie, and just also kind of crazy in the way that they structured it. There's such a great cast here. I mean, we talked about Christopher Lee, we talked about Michael Gough, who had already played Alfred in Tim Burton's Batman movies, and then you have Christina Ricci as the sort of the young romantic interest, I guess you could say. Although, I mean, they don't really. They end up together in the end, but at the same time, it's not really
very platonic. Kind of,
you have Michael Gambon, who was pre Dumbledore at this point. Martin Landau's in the prelude, the opening of the movie, which I have to say, this is the opening sequence of this movie probably has some of my absolute favorite Danny Elfman music that he's ever written. And I love this score. I always have loved this score, and that introduction in particular is just wonderful.
Yes.
He just absolutely captures that moment perfectly. And it's just really it ties into what the production designer, the art director, the camera people, or the costume, and then Chivo, Emmanuel Lubezki, who's now a 3-time Oscar winner. This was, I think, one of the first times I really recognized his name. And he just does wonderful work with Burton in this film as far as shooting this movie. And I love the fact that one of the things I really appreciate about this movie is that it really does kind of feel... It's something where I feel like you can kind of tell that it's done on sets. And I like that. It's kind of weird to describe that because of the fact that it's like, if you feel like it is very much on sets, it kind of takes you out of the movie. Here, I feel like it takes you into the movie.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Burton perfected that. Just, I mean, he shot this in London, I think on the same stage as he did the Batman movies on, and I think what
Yeah,
he does, you know, you're on a set. They're all beautifully produced sets, whether it's Gotham City or you know the woods of upstate New York. But
right.
it doesn't take you out of it as in like, oh look, there's a set. It's clearly a set. It sort of is like, oh my god, we're in this created world that like between the cinematography and the music and the performances, you know you're on a set, but you know like you're kind of like enveloped in it as opposed to like, oh, I can see the stitches and the
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, and Miranda Richardson is fantastic in this. Jeffrey Jones has some really good moments in it, and you know, Miranda Richardson, like this was one of the first things I remember seeing her in. I mean, she's made an impression in a bunch of other movies. I mean, you know, uh, Cronenberg's Spider a couple of years later was a great
Sure.
example of her. She was also in Harry Potter. I mean, it's funny because a lot of these actors either went on to be in Harry Potter or they went on to be in Lord of the Rings. And
Yeah,
I mean,
I mean, the
even
who's who of English talent. There
yeah,
was absolutely.
yeah, and it's a way. That's one of the things that's really great about the way that because of the people that he's gotten to populate this universe, even Christopher Walken. I mean, you feel once you see Christopher Walken in the flashbacks as the headless horseman, it gives the character even more menace because you imagine that ferocity of Walken's performance in those flashbacks.
Yeah.
And I will say it's funny because of the fact that all when I watched it this morning, because I didn't get to rewatching it until this morning. It occurred to me that Depp and Walken had been in a really cheesy '90s thriller called Nick of Time together, and so this is kind of a reunion of those two actors, and it's like,
Oh
wow,
god,
I'd forgotten about that.
that is weird.
Yeah. Um, but I love the affection that this movie and that Burton in this movie has for the old Hammer horror films and even the Universal horror films. Like the ending at the windmill reminds me of the original Frankenstein.
Yeah,
At
absolutely.
the climax of the original Frankenstein, I mean, I love, you know, it's like we talked about earlier how this really is kind of the only pure horror film that he's ever done. And I mean, you had that quote of him that like horror really scares him, and so it's like that's probably why he hasn't. He takes the gothic nature of it into his films, but at the same time, he doesn't really follow through with any like real horror movies. Um, but he's really it really does kind of make me wish that maybe something else could come along that might get him to make a horror movie because I think he'd be really capable of doing a terrific one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky because I feel like his approach to horror, even in other films he's done that have had like whether they're you know The Witch and Big Fish, or
Yeah.
even if you go back to you know Pee Wee's Big Adventure, the Large Marge bit,
Yes.
he's very much a like ghost story around the campfire, boo
Mm-hmm.
horror, and I don't know if his wheelhouse he could do a sustained like dread. You know, like I mean,
Yeah.
there's a great sequence with a little kid, you know, hiding out and watching his parents be slaughtered by the
Mm-hmm.
headless hawk. And, you know, but I still don't know that he could do. You know, I'd be definitely game to watch him try because I think it'd be a great break from what he's doing now. But I always have this sense that he's a lot more capable and comfortable in a sort of like
Right.
you know, yeah, Maccabi kind of like boo world of like of weirdness and goth and like crazy that he is in like a structured world of like
Yeah.
terrible happening kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and even some of his, I mean, even the other like movies that he's done that are sort of remotely close to like horror. If you look at Sweeney Todd, which is first and foremost a musical, so you have that part of the narrative that's playing next to the horror elements of the narrative, and then you have Dark Shadows, which becomes almost a comedy to a certain extent, and very much plays as sort of a family comedy. Yeah, I mean, you are right about that. It's like the idea of him doing sort of a very sustained dread, because I mean even this is diffused by humor times, and I mean that's always kind of going to be the case, and there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I think humor deployed right in a horror movie looks a lot like this, because of the
Yes.
fact that it's a release from the tension that you're supposed to be feeling in the movie. And
Sure.
but the thing is, it's like I really like the tension that Tim Burton sustains in this movie. It's really quite effective.
Yeah, and I really do love, like, I think, we were talking about how it's sort of science versus mystics, but I do really like a good detective story, and in
Yeah.
many ways, I'm curious what Matt Reeves is going to do with this new Batman, because I keep reading that it's going to show him as a detective.
Yeah.
And one of the I think they've never really done, and like it's hard because you got to do an action film and sort of you got maybe 120 minutes to do your Batman story.
Yeah.
But like as a mystery, as a detective movie, and I think watching him approach it like a detective, succumb to the idea that this is bigger and more supernatural than he knows about the world, but then sort of break that down as a mystery and scientifically and find out what else is going on, I think is what really what makes the film elevated for me too, and really brought me into it.
Oh yeah, and that's one of the things that ultimately makes the film as successful as it is, because of the fact that it gets both of those. It gets the mystery of the headless horseman, trying to suss out the headless horseman, tied into the mystery of the town and all of these things that are going on in the town, and it's all of that is just it's just triggered by one character saying, "Oh, there are 5 victims in 4 graves," and it's
Yeah.
like, and you kind of at the time you kind of get the impression of, "Oh, okay, I think I know where they're going with it," and then as it continues to unfold, and then the way they bring the two together is just really effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just sort of, it really helps propel the story forward and bring you in beyond. And what's great is instead of the headless horseman bits and the kills getting like repetitive and whatever, it's a nice break from each part of it. Like whenever it starts to get a little too weedy, you've got a great little scene, with the horseman.
Yeah. So when did you see this in theaters in 1999?
I definitely went opening weekend. I was really,
Okay.
I was when I heard that the guy who wrote Seven was teaming with Tim Burton to do a Headless Horseman movie with Johnny Depp, I was like, I need to know.
Yeah.
So I definitely, I was, and as much as I was anticipating it, I was actually really blown away by how much I enjoyed it and how much of it was not what I was really expecting it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I think I was it's funny because I think I was kind of lukewarm on Burton when this came out, and like you, I saw it opening weekend, and it's funny because if I remember correctly, this was a Thanksgiving release.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, it was a Thanksgiving release, which was always hilarious to me. That it's like, oh hey, we're gonna do a horror movie for you, but at the same time, I mean, you know, now obviously Thanksgiving releases don't look like this. Thanksgiving the release windows don't necessarily look like the way they did in even 20 years ago. I mean, I think we might have, I don't know if you and I touched on it, but I mean, one of the things that I noticed this year as far as 1999, like there really aren't a whole lot of big action blockbusters throughout the year. There certainly weren't a lot that really populate the summer like they do now.
No, no. And what's weird is now that I'm thinking of that Thanksgiving weekend and this being like kind of like a weird placement for it and being like a kind of action horror hybrid. I don't know if it came out the same weekend as competition, but I remember being really wanting to see this film. And a friend of mine was like, no, 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 no. The one that's going to be good is Arnold Schwarzenegger fighting the devil in End of Days, which I think either came out
It
the week before or the week after.
They both came out around the same time, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly.
Yeah, which is again weird that these two competing, and everyone. I think if you rolled the dice or had asked somebody a few months prior, like Arnold Schwarzenegger having taken a break
Yeah.
from acting for like a year or two, coming back in his first like horror film maybe since like The Predator, fighting
Yeah.
the devil, that would be a huge thing, and that did not do very well. Not
No.
regarded what this film was, but they both came out within a week of each other.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean it wasn't a very good movie either. I mean that like we did a friend of mine and I did End of Days earlier this year, and yeah, it's not a good movie at all. But yeah, you're right. I mean, those were both about the same time, and yeah, yeah. I mean, this was definitely. And it's funny because of the fact that like this was actually a decent hit. It made over 100 million at the box office. I mean, it was reasonably successful, and that's the thing that kind of is kind of remarkable about this is it's still kind of one. I mean, he's had bigger hits since then, but it's still kind of one of the biggest hits of Tim Burton's career. Like,
I mean, it's also one of the ones that was both a big hit and also a critically successful film too. Where I mean,
Yeah.
he's had them, but of the films, especially in his later period, like he's either had one or the other. Like I think the last people really maybe Sweeney Todd or Big Fish, but those films didn't quite set the box office ablaze. And then he's had films that have done, I think the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie made money, and some other of those Burton remakes have done fairly well business, but like some of them have just been like,
yeah.
whoa. Like who anyone could have done it too. Like it feels like we've gotten to the point where it's not just Tim Burton doing a Tim Burton cover of Dark Shadows. It's somebody doing a cover of Tim Burton doing a cover of, you know what I mean? Like it's just so weird.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, and one of the other ones that we didn't talk about was Alice in Wonderland, which was the biggest one, where it's like it got critical drubbing, and rightfully so. It's not a very good movie, but it made $1 billion. I mean, it really was one of the movies that started this live action remake from run of Disney, and which Tim Burton has gone back to with Dumbo, which is it has the Tim Burton elements of it, and you see the Tim Burton in it, but at the same time you also see you see the good parts of Tim Burton in it, you also see the bad parts of Tim Burton in it. And I mean it's
I mean, if he had done that film right after Sleepy Hollow, I think you would have gotten a lot more of the Tim Burton rub of where he was of the in between. But I think he has sort of just, and part of it is also, I think, age. You look at, it's very interesting. You look at, you're reviewing the year of '99, and the amount of filmmakers, new, crazy, breathtaking filmmakers that have been around for a bit in 2019, 20 years, 30. And then other filmmakers, we've had, '99 also has Scorsese, it has Tim Burton, it has people that have been around, still kind of, energized and doing their thing.
Yeah.
But now have kind of also, as you get older, as you get less hungry, as you've also sort of pushed the limit very far, I think you kind of you don't have it the same way, or you just have to have the right project or spark of inspiration to not just do a good job, but to really sort of do what you did when you were younger and hadn't done anything yet,
Right. And it's weird because of the fact that like as big and as exciting as this year was creatively speaking, it's also one of I can't help but feel like it's also one of the last ones where even if those movies failed, that was perfectly acceptable. Like because of the fact that those movies stayed on, in the early 21st century or in the early 2000s, you had the started to see the rise of Marvel with X-Men, Spider-Man. You had Harry Potter. You had Lord of the Rings, and you had these really big swings in franchises to where now the goalpost now like the goalposts have been moved to slightly, to more ambitious financial risks, which, in those cases of Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and the Marvel movies, ended up leading to big financial rewards, to where something like this, which is still reasonably mid-level, the middle movies of that Burton made in Sleepy Hollow, that Scorsese made in Bring Out the Dead, they don't really hold as much. They're not really as interested in them on the studio level.
No, and you would have to make a Sleepy Hollow if it was made today that could sustain. It would have to be part one of a trilogy at minimum.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just do like even if they could have been like, even if they left it open, where like hypothetically if the film made enough money in Burnham's game, even though he doesn't really do many sequels, to come back and do a follow-up, of that town or whatever, which you could do. It was not designed that way in any way. Whereas now you could only make that movie if it not only would gross what it needed to gross, but also it's just the changing of the times, but also a snapshot of that particular period and how you could do something like that and make it and have it be successful just for that,
Yeah. Yeah, and and the thing is, it's like it's a shame, it's like I sort of was lamenting a little bit earlier about the sort of lack of really original projects that Burton has had, and especially over the past 20 years. I mean, you look at Big Fish, which granted is an adaptation of a book, but it's still not. It's a book that, at this point, like, is a novel really something that people are aware of compared to, a movie property like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory,
yes,
or Planet of the Apes, or something like that. Big Fish, you're right. I mean, it is still kind of original, even if it's not completely original. I mean, the same can be said about Ed Wood, where it's like, yeah, it's based on a real person's life, but it's still got that signature that made Tim Burton so special.
Yeah.
And I think, and the thing is, I do think, and certainly Burton has tried to adapt by that and tried to build a career out of that. I mean, I think it's been difficult for him because of the fact that he just, like we said, the landscape is different, and it's like, you think about the career, that you think about what he did with regards to the Batman movies, and it's like, to a certain extent, like, that was an example of him being able to work within the studio system for the sake of franchises while also getting his personal vision. But at the same time, you look at what happened on after Batman Returns was not quite as well received as the first Batman. It's like Warner Brothers got cold feet, and it's like, whoa, we've got to pull something back here, and we know what happened to that franchise after Batman Returns.
Yeah, and I think he went through hell, and that also might be why his films have sort of been the path of least resistance, because I feel like part of him is also like he's an artist. He just wants to he just really just wants to be left alone to create. And in some way he figures, if I can maybe just sustain financially and create weird stuff, like just play with clay, as long as I do it in the sandbox, and I don't really want to fight a system that I know that I can't fight anymore.
Yeah. Did you before we wrap this up, did you have anything more that you wanted to say about Sleepy Hollow?
No, I mean, I again, I watched it again, and I remember when I first saw it, I remember thinking that it would be a PG-13 kind of fun. I was curious what Burton's take would be on it, how spooky and like how like gothic and weird it would be, and I was interested to see, all the cameos he put in it. I did not expect it to be as gory and violent.
Yeah.
And even for that time period, it wasn't like insanely gory and violent. And I'm not sure if it got an R rating or not.
It did.
It did. Oh yeah. So there was gore in it that I was really not expecting. Much like you watch a Hammer film and you thought they were just sort of the British version of the Universal horror films, and they would push the limits of like sex and horror and blood and stuff.
Yeah.
But also there's some very like you watch Batman Returns, for instance, or even the original Batman, but particularly in Returns, there's some real mean, like angry, dark, cynical bits in there where you're like, wow, is Tim Burton going through some stuff, And with this film, as much a love letter as it is to horror and it's mystical and like there's a lot of that light in it. There's some darkness that is very strange, and I wonder if that was something that, because again, like the script was written by Andrew Kevin Walker. It was originally going to be Walker wrote with Yeager to direct, and it was supposed to be more of like a 7-ish kind of like almost a straight low budget slasher. And I wonder how much of it, I know a lot of it got changed and opened up to more of the story and the people than a straight up slasher, but how much of it is intractable from the fact that the main character is someone who collects heads.
Yeah.
You've got you're gonna have some decapitations, but you don't expect to see them as viscerally and as brutally. And even the ones you don't see as violently, like there's a shot of one character where you don't expect that person's gonna lose their head. I think it's a small child, and you just see him putting something in the sack after them.
Yeah.
Which is great. I mean, that to me is like that is terrifying, because you did all the work after that. So there were things like that I just wasn't expecting.
Right.
When I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I mean to think about this as sort of like a lower budget slasher is really kind of interesting. I do kind of want to see that take now of it, and I mean, who knows? It's 20 years, maybe somebody will actually do that. But at the same time, I would have liked to have seen Yeager and Andrew Kevin Walker do that version. But at the same time, I love what I think. The addition of Burton, I mean, brings his personal vision into it, and to a certain extent, it's like, and this was executive produced by Francis Ford Coppola as well, and Scott Rudin. So I mean, some couple pretty big players. So, I mean, it's got some prestige to it, and I think this won some. I think it won one or two technical Oscars for like production design and stuff like that too, if I remember correctly.
Direction and costumes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it deserves to, because it looks absolutely phenomenal. But yeah, this it's funny. This was a really interesting year for horror, because during the summer you had the Blair Witch Project, which had a successful run after Sundance, and then you had The Sixth Sense, which just came out of nowhere.
Sure.
And this movie is really like the third of that sort of triumvirate of really successful horror movies, and they couldn't be more different, each one of them. And that's that's something that's really fascinating about this, and one of the things that's so exciting about this year, because of the fact that you had different filmmakers. I mean, those two were by newcomers, relative newcomers, and Tim Burton was certainly more of a seasoned pro compared to some of the filmmakers from this year. And you had him working on such a high level to make probably one of the more entertaining movies of the year.
Yeah. And you also had it following. I mean, I think one of the things that was on my mind, and also it's 99, was this. He threaded the needle that, they couldn't do with The Haunting.
Yeah.
Which was another adaptation, sort of a mixture of like big blockbuster action summer horror film, and everything that is right that works in Sleepy Hollow just fell like a wet fart in that film.
Yeah,
it avoided all the trappings that film fell into by doing different stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was so disappointed in The Haunting when it came out. Like, I was really looking forward to it because I liked the cast. It was
Sure.
Jan de Bont doing something different than like action, but at the same time, it's also kind of confirmation that, well, maybe Jan de Bont shouldn't be doing anything other than action.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, Sleepy Hollow basically kind of avoided a lot of the traps that The Haunting fell into, and it's something. But I think the thing that I always take out from this experience of watching Sleepy Hollow is is just the experience of watching Sleepy Hollow, watching a movie where the images just really kind of sear into your brain, whether it's just simply the look of the town of Sleepy Hollow, the way Christopher Walken looks with his head, as well as the way the headless horseman goes about his business in this movie. And it's really just a striking piece of work. It is truly like it is truly, I think, one of the most exciting pieces of filmmaking that Tim Burton's ever done. And it's something that, you know, and I think that's part of why I kind of would like to see him return to horror in this type of brute force way, because I want to see if he's got anything else in there. If he doesn't, that's fine, but I want to see him do something that seems to really mean something to him again. And I haven't really felt that for a while with a
Yeah.
Burton film.
Yeah. I think he just needs the right project to sort of unleash that.
Yeah. But David, thank you very much for joining me today, as well as throughout the year. We've discussed a few pretty big movies. I mean, all three of the movies we discussed were among the more successful ones of the year, and it's a really interesting conversation to have when it comes to when you look at the movies that did really well this year. It's such a wide variety, and I
Yeah.
mean, even The Matrix, Sleepy Hollow, and The Mummy are three very different types of movies, but they all have one thing in common where it's like they're big budget attempts to entertain the audience. And even if I don't necessarily think some of them work more than others, it's really interesting to see the ways different filmmakers approach that subject this year.
Yeah. I agree. It's a crazy year, man.
But yeah, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure, always.
I'd like to thank David Spaltro for joining me today. It was really great to talk to him about these movies, and this was his final episode of the Class of 1999 series. I definitely want to have him. I definitely want to have him on to discuss movies in general, not just his own, but just movies in particular, because of the fact that I've really enjoyed talking to the filmmakers I've gotten to talk to this year about these movies, and that's really a fun conversation. In addition to the horror episodes of the podcast that you're going to get, and there's one more that I haven't recorded yet, but I do hope to by the end of October.